Montana Territory, 1882. The wind was hard that morning, pulling dry snow across the open plain and slapping it against the train platform in the town of Red Rock. But Briner Bishop stood still beneath his hat brim, boots planted in the frost, his eyes steady on the iron engine as it hissed and slowed. He had never ordered a bride before. The letter had come 4 months ago, written in careful script from a woman in Kansas. No flowery words, no false hope, just honesty. Her name was Grace Lark, 22. Lost her parents to fever 2 years ago. No siblings, no dowry. Just her hands, her faith, and a willingness to work. Brenner had read that letter more times than he cared to count. Now the train door opened, and there she was wrapped in a worn wool coat, gloved hands clenched around a carpet bag, eyes darting across the platform until they found him. He stepped forward. "Grace," he asked. She took a breath, nodded. Her face was pale from the cold, cheeks pinked, lips chapped. But her eyes were wide with something like fear, or maybe just the weight of everything she had left behind. "I am Grace," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I am Briner Bishop," he said. "I am glad you came." She held out her hand. "I do not have a dowry," she said quickly, like she needed to get it over with. "Not a penny. I came with nothing." He took her hand gently. "You brought yourself. I already have what I need." Her eyes filled then, but she blinked fast and looked away. He did not press. Instead, he took her bag and led her to the wagon. The ride to his ranch was silent for a while. The land stretched out wide and white around them, snow clinging to the low hills and cottonwood trees along the river. The sky was pale blue, the sun weak but shining. "You live alone?" she asked at last. He nodded. "My folks died 5 years ago. I run cattle mostly. Some horses. It is quiet, but it is good land." She looked down at her gloves. "I can cook, clean. So, tend to animals. I will work hard." Brenner glanced at her. "You do not have to prove anything. You are not here to earn your place." She was quiet again after that, but her shoulders eased. The ranch house sat low against the hills, timbered strong, with smoke curling from the stone chimney. Brenner helped her down from the wagon, carried her bag inside. The house smelled of cedar and coffee. It was warm, with a fire going in the hearth, and tidy though plainly so. "I made up the spare room," he said. "You can rest. Settle in." She stepped inside, taking it all in. "It is more than I expected." That night, she helped with supper: thin stew, biscuits, and dried apples stewed in butter and sugar. She moved carefully, watching how he did things, asking where things were. She never acted like she was owed anything. She never asked what he expected in return. He liked that. After supper, they sat by the fire. She mended a sock from her bag. He read from the ledger book, glancing at her now and then. Once, he caught her looking at him. She looked away. He set the book down. "You all right?" She nodded. "Just tired, but grateful." "Me too," he said. The next morning, she was already up when he came down from the loft. She had swept the floor, boiled coffee, and was folding the last of the clean cloths. "You do not have to do all this." Grace looked up. "I want to." They fell into a rhythm over the next week. She fed the chickens, helped split kindling, learned how to saddle the gentler mare. He taught her how to keep the fire burning through the night, how to patch the roof with pine tar, how to mark the cattle brands in the ledger book. She never complained once about the cold. One night, as wind howled outside, she sat close to the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "Why did you send for a wife?" she asked softly. He leaned back in his chair. "I came back from the war to find my folks gone, the ranch half fallen. I built it back up, but it was lonely, and I wanted more than quiet. I wanted someone to build with." She looked into the fire. "I thought no one would want someone like me. No money, no family. A girl who had to bury her mother alone in the cold and sell everything just to eat." His heart ached at her words. He stood, crossed the room, and knelt beside her chair. "You are not alone anymore," he said. She looked at him, really looked, and her eyes softened. She reached out and touched his hand. "I believe you." He held her gaze. He meant every word. Days passed. Snow melted into mud. The cattle pushed toward the fences, restless with the change in weather. Grace laughed more now. Her cheeks grew pink from sun instead of cold. Then one afternoon, Brenner came back from the far pasture with a cut on his arm and a limp in his step. A steer had bolted, caught him on a low rail. Grace met him at the door, took one look, and pulled him inside. She cleaned the wound, wrapped it, her hands steady. "You should have called for me," she said, her voice tight. "I am all right." "You are not meant to do it alone anymore," she said, her eyes fierce. He looked at her, then smiled. "I know." That night, they sat close again, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her. The fire cracked softly. Wind whispered against the windows. "Brenner, would it be all right if I stayed in your room tonight? Just to sleep. I do not want to be alone." He looked down at her. "Yes, you can stay." He led her upstairs, pulled back the quilt, and watched her settle in. He lay beside her, careful not to touch, but near enough that she could feel his warmth. In the dark, she reached for his hand. "I feel safe here," she whispered. He closed his fingers around hers. "So do I." Neither of them let go. By the time March thawed into April, the earth had begun to soften, and the cottonwoods lining the narrow creek behind the barn stretched delicate green fingers toward the sky. Grace stood in the garden plot beside the house, sleeves rolled to her elbows, knuckles buried in the damp dirt. She leaned her weight into the hoe, turning the soil in slow, even rows. Brenner watched from the porch, one boot resting against the rail, arms crossed. She worked with quiet focus, her brow furrowed beneath the bonnet she'd stitched from scrap ticking. When she glanced up and caught him watching, she didn't look away. She straightened and wiped the back of her hand across her forehead. "You keep standing there," she called. "I'll start charging you for supervision." He pushed off the rail and crossed the yard. "You've got a good eye for spacing," he said, nodding at the rows. "I helped my mother grow squash and beans when I was little. She used to say the ground remembers how to feed you if you treat it kindly." He crouched beside her. "You have seed. Only some. Radish, cabbage, a bit of onion. Not enough for a full season. I'll ride to town next week. There's a merchant out of Helena comes through with seed packets." She nodded. "I'd like that." Brenner picked up the hoe and began working beside her. They didn't speak for a while. The scrape of metal against earth and the call of a red-winged blackbird from the creek filled the quiet. When he paused to straighten his back, he caught her studying him. "What is it?" he asked. "You don't seem the kind to talk much, but I can tell you're always thinking." He tilted his head. "What makes you say that? You look at everything like it's asking you a question." He let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. "And you? You've got a way of listening even when no one's speaking." She smiled, faint but sure. "I was always the quiet one. My uncle used to say I could hear a lie before it left someone's mouth. Can you hear one now?" "No," she said. "That's why I stayed." That night, after supper, Grace brought out a small wooden box wrapped in flannel and set it on the table. "I want to show you something," she said. Brenner wiped his hands on a towel and sat across from her. She opened the box. Inside were 3 hand-carved figurines: a horse, a kneeling woman, and a bird with wings outstretched. The paint had worn off in places. The horse's tail had chipped. "My father carved these for me when I was a girl. He said to keep them when I was scared, so I'd remember love could take many shapes: strength, prayer, and flight." Brenner touched the edge of the box gently. "They're fine work. They were all I could carry when I left Kansas," she said. "I kept them wrapped inside my petticoat on the train." He looked at her, eyes steady. "You don't have to keep them hidden here." She replaced the lid, slower this time. "I believe that now." Later, as the fire died down and shadows lengthened across the floor, they lingered at the hearth. Grace sat cross-legged on the rug, her mending in her lap, though she wasn't sewing. "I never asked what your mother was like," she said. Brenner shifted on the bench, elbows resting on his knees. She had a sharp tongue, but soft hands. She'd sing when she was tired to keep herself from crying. "Always said sorrow had its place, but it ought not take root." Grace lowered her eyes. "That sounds like someone who knew loss. She buried 2 children before me. Fever and a fall from a wagon. After that, she never wasted a single word." Grace looked toward the window, the glass dark with night. "I used to think if I kept moving, grief wouldn't catch up. But it found me anyway." He reached down and took her hand, still calloused from garden work. "It doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." She didn't pull away. The next morning, they rode out to the northern boundary where the fence had sagged from snow weight. Grace rode the bay mare now without needing help to mount. She carried herself different, too straighter in the saddle, more certain with the reins. They worked side by side, pulling wire taut, hammering new nails into the posts. When a gust of wind blew her bonnet back, She let it fall, hair loosening in the breeze. She laughed once when the hammer slipped and caught her boot heel. "I'm not built for this work," she said, shaking her head. "You're doing it anyway," Brenner said. "That's what matters." She paused, leaning against the post. "I was afraid I'd come here and still feel like I had nowhere to belong. And now," her voice was quiet, "now I think I might be finding it." He didn't answer right away, just reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers warm against her skin. She didn't flinch. That night, they moved together without speaking. She folded her quilt and carried it into his room, setting it at the foot of his bed. He lit the oil lamp and turned down the covers while she undid the buttons at her collar. When they lay down, he gathered her close, hand resting at the small of her back. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. "I won't let you be," he said. And for the first time in years, neither of them dreamed of anything they had lost. The first thunderstorm of the season rolled in just after dusk, dragging a curtain of slate-colored rain across the prairie. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine resin. Grace stood at the window, oil lamp behind her casting amber light onto her sleeve, watching lightning fork over the ridgeline. Brenner came in from the barn, hair damp, boots tracked with mud. He hung his coat by the door, then moved to the basin to wash. She watched the way his shoulders dipped slightly, a familiar weariness to his movements, the kind born of years spent working land no one else would have bothered to tame. "You got caught in it?" she asked, still facing the window. "Had to move the colts under the lean-to," he said. "One spooked. Thought he could outrun the sky." She turned. "Did he?" Brenner dried his hands on a rag, then met her eyes. "No one ever does." That night, with rain drumming steady on the roof, Brenner brought a wooden box down from the loft. He set it on the table between them and opened the lid. Inside lay a scatter of letters, folded maps, and a faded piece of fabric stitched with initials. "My grandfather's," he said. "He came out from Tennessee before the war, built the first cabin here. Said the land spoke to him. Not kindly, but honest." Grace traced the edge of a map with her finger. "You've kept it all these years." "Didn't know what for until now." She looked up. "Why now?" "Because you've made this house feel like it has a future." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "I didn't think I could be part of something that lasted. Everything I've known had an end. Then let this be the start." They left the box open on the table, its contents breathing a little more air than they had in decades. The following week, they rode to a neighbor's place 6 miles east, a couple with 3 boys and a milk cow that wandered more than it stayed penned. Grace brought a jar of preserves and a tin of sewing needles. Brenner hauled fence posts in the wagon bed. The woman, Ruth, had thick arms and a laugh that startled birds from trees. She pressed a parcel into Grace's hand as they said goodbye, a length of blue calico with tiny white flowers. "From my own wedding dress," Ruth said. "Thought you might find use for it." Grace ran her thumb along the fabric later that evening. She didn't ask anything in return. "Not everything comes with a price," Brenner said. "Not here." She laid the cloth across her lap. "I'd like to make something from it." "What kind of something?" She folded the fabric gently. "A dress fit for standing beside the man I build a life with." Brenner didn't answer right away. He just reached out and brushed a knuckle down her cheek, then nodded once, as though sealing a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The next morning came with still air and a sky the color of washed bone. They rode north to mend a break in the stone wall where elk had pushed through. Grace carried the wire spool this time, her gloves stained from rust and sap. As they worked, she asked, "Did you ever think you'd marry?" "No," he said. "I thought I'd die young or stay alone." She looked over. "And now, I think I was waiting on the right reason." She set the spool down. "What made me the right one?" He straightened, wiped his brow. "You didn't come here looking to be saved. You came ready to live." They shared a quiet moment there, wind stirring the grass at their feet, a hawk circling high above. Neither of them spoke again until the last post was secured. That night, she took the blue calico into the spare room and laid it flat. She cut it slowly, measuring twice, her stitches even, her fingers sure. When the dress hung finished by the window 3 days later, it caught the morning light like something meant to last. They stood together on the porch, watching the sun rise over the distant hills. "I've written a letter," Grace said, her hands folded in front of her, "to the county clerk in Deer Lodge. About a license." Brenner turned toward her. You want to marry here? I want to marry you, she said. Here just feels like the place we started. He touched the edge of her sleeve. Then let's finish what we began. The wedding was quiet, just Ruth and her husband as witnesses, a preacher from the next town over who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and sage. Grace wore the calico dress. Brenner wore his father's coat, brushed clean and pressed. When the preacher asked if they would build a life together, they each answered without pause. Afterward, they walked back to the house hand in hand. No music, no feast, just the land around them, quiet and wide, and the wind soft through the cottonwoods. Inside, she hung her dress by the hearth. He poured 2 cups of coffee, and they sat on the floor, shoulders touching, firelight on their faces. Grace leaned into him. Do you still believe I brought enough? He looked at her, eyes steady and warm. I believe you brought everything. And in the hush that followed, with the fire low and their fingers intertwined, there was no storm waiting, no past catching up. Only the sound of 2 hearts learning to beat alongside each other, steady and sure. By late May, the river ran louder, swollen with snow melt, and the prairie grass reached up past Brenner's boots. The hush of winter had long been broken, replaced with the steady hum of bees returning to the clover and the high cry of hawks circling over the grazing land. Grace stood barefoot in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, shaping bread dough with calm precision. The window above the basin was open, letting in the scent of lilac and turned earth. Brenner had gone before sunrise to check on a calving mare up near the tree line, and she'd listened for the creak of the barn door ever since. When the wagon finally came into view, she stepped outside, wiping her hands on her skirt. Brenner pulled the team to a halt with a soft word, and Grace's eyes caught the bundle in his arms, a thick canvas sack, stained at the corners. Traded with Tomas, Brenner said, climbing down. He passed through from Virginia City with a cart full of goods. Had some things I figured we could use. Grace reached for the sack and opened it on the porch rail. Inside were a tin of lamp oil, coarse muslin, a bundle of carrot seed, and a pair of worn but sturdy leather-bound journals. She traced the edge of one cover with her thumb. You thought of me. He shrugged, but his mouth curved just slightly. Figured you might want a place to write things down. I haven't written anything of my own since Kansas. Only letters to strangers. You're not a stranger now. She looked up, sunlight catching in her hair. Would you want to read it, if I ever did? I'd want to know anything you decided to share. That evening, after supper, she sat at the table with one of the journals, the pages blank and smelling faintly of dust and tannin. She dipped the nib of the pen into ink and paused, the tip just above the paper. What would you write first? Brenner asked from his chair near the hearth. She didn't look up. That I woke today and didn't feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. That's a good place to start. A week later, they rode east along the far ridge to mark the grazing boundary. The sun was high, and Grace tied her hair up with a strip of linen torn from her old petticoat. Brenner pointed out a spot where the cottonwoods thickened along a stream bed. Used to camp here with my father, he said. He'd lay out a tarp and tell stories until the coyotes started up. Grace dismounted and knelt at the edge of the stream. Was he kind to you? Brenner nodded, hands on his hips. Didn't say much, but he never raised his hand. Taught me how to hold a rope, how to read clouds. Always said a man ought to leave a place better than he found it. She dipped her hand into the water, then looked up. Do you think he'd be proud of what you've built? Brenner let a breath out through his nose. I think he'd be proud I didn't quit. When they returned home, Grace brought out the second journal and handed it to him. You should write too, she said. He held the book like it might slip through his fingers. I never had much use for writing. You don't have to write for anyone but yourself. He set it down gently, then looked at her. All right, I'll try. That night, they lay in bed with the window open, the scent of wild sage drifting in. Grace rested her head on his chest, her hand over his heart. I want to plant something permanent, she said, voice low. Not just for the season. Something that'll come back even when we're old. He brushed his fingers through her hair. Then we'll plant trees. In the garden? No, he said. Out back, where we can see them from the porch. Every year, the roots will go deeper. She closed her eyes. I'd like that. The next morning, they walked out to the rise behind the barn. Brenner carried a spade, Grace a small cotton sack with saplings wrapped in damp burlap. They dug side by side. working in silence broken only by birdsong and the soft scrape of metal against soil. When the last sapling was planted, Grace knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. "They'll need watching." "They'll get it," Brenner said. "Same as you did." She stood and dusted off her hands, her eyes meeting his. "Is that how you see me? Something you watched over?" "No," he said. "Something I chose to stand beside." The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves of the young trees. Grace reached for his hand, and they stood together, the land stretching out before them, full of what they'd made and what was still to come. By early June, the rhythm of the land had softened. The calves were steady on their legs, the hens broody with the length of the days, and the house had taken on a lived-in stillness like it had finally settled into being home. Brenner stood beside the barn hitching post, running a rasp along the edge of a worn horseshoe. The rasp's scrape blended with the low murmur of wind threading through the cottonwoods behind the shed. Grace knelt nearby, sorting an old crate of leather tack. Her sleeves were rolled, and her hands moved with quiet decisiveness over each strap and buckle. "I've been thinking," she said, not glancing up, "about the meadow behind the far ridge. The one with the low dip and the wild thyme." Brenner paused, setting the rasp aside. "What about it?" "I think it would hold a small orchard. Apples, maybe. If we could get seedlings from the Bitterroot Valley." He dusted his palms. "You planning to grow cider?" She smiled faintly, still sorting. "No. I'm thinking of shade. Of trees that'll last past us." He nodded, gaze drifting toward the distant hills. "We could make the trip after roundup. Trade for saplings, maybe even cuttings." Grace stood, wiping her hands. "I've already written to a woman in Stevensville who grafts. She's sending a reply by post." Brenner looked at her then, his expression unreadable for a breath. "You've made plans without waiting on me." "I didn't think I needed to wait," she said, steady. He stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't." Later that week, they rode into Red Rock together for the first time since winter. Grace had stitched herself a new bodice from pale brown twill, and Brenner had trimmed his beard with the small shears she'd sharpened on the whetstone. The town was busier than either of them expected. Spring had drawn out the merchants and freighters, and children ran barefoot through the main street, trailing laughter and dust. Grace stopped at the mercantile to pick up the parcel from Stevensville. The shopkeeper, a stooped man with a white apron and ink-stained fingers, handed her a wrapped bundle and nodded at Brenner. "Didn't think we'd see you in town again so soon, Bishop." "Didn't think I'd have reason to," Brenner said. Grace opened the parcel once they were back in the wagon. Inside were 5 folded wax paper packets, each labeled in a woman's neat cursive: Winesap, Duchess, Greening, Northern Spy, and Transparent. "She sent samples," Grace said, turning them over. Brenner lifted one. "Sounds like a promise." They planted the first saplings 10 days later, just before a soft rain settled over the hills. Grace marked each with a thin stake and a strip of muslin torn from an old chemise. The orchard wouldn't bear fruit for years, but she walked among the seedlings as if they were already in bloom. That night, Brenner came in from the shed carrying a small oilskin pouch. He set it on the table without a word. Grace dried her hands on her apron and opened it slowly. Inside was a silver pin shaped like a sparrow with outstretched wings, its detail worn but intact. "It belonged to my mother," Brenner said. "She gave it to me the day I left for the war. Told me to give it to the woman who made the quiet feel like something I wanted to come home to." Grace didn't speak. She stepped forward, took the pin, and fastened it to the collar of her dress with careful fingers. "I'll keep it safe," she said. He brushed a curl from her neck. "I know." By midsummer, the orchard had taken root. The garden had bloomed thick with cabbage and early beans, and the house smelled of sun-warmed linens and rosemary hung from the rafters to dry. Grace spent her mornings writing in the journal, her script growing more fluid with each page. Brenner had begun sketching rough outlines of fence lines and grazing paths in the back of his own, a habit he hadn't expected to stick. One warm evening, she found him standing by the orchard with his hand resting against the tallest sapling. The sky behind him was streaked with orange and rose, the sun just brushing the edge of the hills. "You always come out here at dusk now," she said, stepping beside him. "I like to see how they hold the light," he replied. She leaned into him. "You ever think about what comes next after all this growing?" He looked down at her. "I think about a porch with a few more chairs. A baby asleep inside. Your voice humming while you shell peas. Her fingers curled into his shirt. You've never said that before. I've never had a reason to. She tilted her face up. Would you want that with me? I already do. She kissed him then, slow and quiet, with both hands resting at the base of his neck. When they parted, she drew back just enough to whisper, then let's let it come. Years passed, as they always do, but the house never lost its stillness. It deepened. The orchard grew true, apples forming in the third season, tart and misshapen and full of promise. Grace bore a daughter first, then a son 2 winters later. The children ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter echoing off the hills, and Brenner built a swing between 2 of the older apple trees, its ropes thick with pitch and care. Grace's journals filled a shelf by the hearth. Brenner's sketches turned to maps, then plans for a second barn. They never spoke much about the years before they met. There was no need. The land remembered. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, her head against his shoulder, his hand resting lightly on her knee. Some nights they didn't speak at all. Some nights they did. This, Brenner would say, watching the orchard sway in the wind, is the life I didn't know how to ask for. Grace would smile, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening. Then it's good we found it anyway. They grew old together beneath that sky, side by side, with roots that reached deeper year by year. And the land quiet, honest, and full of their love held them both.